Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to this sort of slight tangent from the Dark Tower retrospectives. Before we go on to the final book in the series, the seventh book, which is just entitled The Dark Tower, and for obvious reasons, I suppose we do need to have a look at the various different attempts to create films, TV series, and numerous other spin-off media from the Dark Tower. Now, I've been following these efforts and attempts for years, since the books were in wide circulation when they were originally being published. There has been discussion and scuttlebutt about the potential of Dark Tower TV series, and this is way back. These efforts, they stretch right back into like the early 2000s, even like the late 90s. There was talk of there potentially being a Dark Tower TV series, and they just never transpired. They never came about. There was scuttlebutt that they were being filmed. There is even evidence that something was attempted at various points throughout the intervening 2 decades. It just never transpired. You have to bear in mind, this is like pre-Netflix, it's pre-streaming services. This was like in the well, I suppose you could consider the latter days of like the classic 1990s Stephen King serial adaptation. So, which many of you will have watched, things like Needful Things, The Tommyknockers, The Stand, which, have varying degrees of success one way or the other. It's a good thing, probably, that it wasn't made back then. It's probably a good thing, because I can't imagine how in the standards and the conventions that were prevalent in like late 1990s, early 2000s TV serials, I just don't see how they could have done justice to a Dark Tower series. It would have lacked all of the ethos and the grit and the feeling of the books. It would have been much more heightened. There's no doubt of that. It would have had more of a sort of Buffy the Vampire Slayer feeling about it. A sort of like ongoing stories, but contained within the format of an episode of the week thing, which is not the way to do the Dark Tower. It's just not the way to do it. It wouldn't, I mean, really, it wasn't until the advent of shows like Lost, which, obviously opinions vary on, but I consider to be an interesting experiment that failed at the last hurdle, that was ruined by a lack of forward thinking, unfortunately. And the last season of Lost absolutely undoes all of the good work that it does. But what Lost and shows like it did is that they established that there was an appetite in sort of Western television for these very long, very complex, ongoing stories that were not sort of episodic, but which had very, very far-reaching mythological notes and beats that built up over time. And that's what you really need for the Dark Tower. That the sort of TV series, the Netflix series, the Amazon TV series is kind of the way to go for it. Because for my money, I mean, it's difficult because The Dark Tower is one of those works. There are certain written works that work because of the format in which they occur. In fact, they are so aware of the format in which they occur that they utilize that as part of their thematic structure. They actually draw on the medium in which they occur for part of their ethos, and that's really, it's very unusual but very cool. And the Dark Tower books do that very, very much so. They are very literary and literate. They are full of allegories and analogies to other works, and they are very aware of the fact that that's what they are, that they're a kind of meta-narrative. There are certain like recurrent symbols and images and things that work within the context of a written story that are very, 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 very hard to communicate in a sort of visual format with any degree of legitimacy. Like, for example, the number 19, there's this thing, because Stephen King started writing The Dark Tower when he was 19, he's used that number as a as almost like it's almost like a cult in its significance within the Dark Tower story. It recurs again and again and again and again and again. And whenever that number or some conjunction of 1 and 9 occur, there's something significant happening. There's usually some sort of reference happening or something like that. And sometimes it's just throwaway, sometimes it is actually quite significant. And the characters start to realize that. The characters themselves actually start to realize the sort of contrived and mythological nature of their own quest, yeah, of their own story arcs. And that, again, is something that's very, very hard to realize in the format of TV or in a visual format, full stop. Another really good example of that would be Terry Pratchett's Discworld. The Discworld books, there are so many adaptations of those books now. There are so many attempts to translate them into cartoons, into live action. The cartoons, the Cosgrove and Hall cartoons, are arguably the closest you get. They're not perfect by any measure, but they are the closest in terms of soul and feeling and just sort of the essence of the Discworld books. But they are notoriously problematic to translate into live action or visual formats because they are, by their very nature, so literary. They are so literate. They are so of the written word that a lot of the stuff that makes the book sing doesn't work when you translate it to live action. You need to actually, the only way to do something like a Discworld live action adaptation is actually to remove it from the source material quite significantly and try to adapt what Pratchett does for the written fantasy story to fantasy television, which is possible. You could do it, but it's very hard to do. It's very hard to do, and to keep the essential soul of what the Discworld is. The Dark Tower has exactly the same problem. That said, I mean, there are certain, King does throw potential adapters a certain bone or a series of bones in that regard, because there are also numerous cinematic touchstones and references built in, baked into the Dark Tower. There's the Lord of the Rings, for one thing. Okay, I mean, originally it was actually the Lord of the Rings elements were derived from King's love of Tolkien's original book, but that could easily be then translated into allegories and analogies for Peter Jackson's adaptations of the Lord of the Rings in cinema. Yeah, you could easily transpose some of the tropes, some of the conventions that the Lord of the Rings films set up, and which now pervade fantastical cinema, into an adaptation of the Dark Tower to chime with audiences who are programmed or conditioned to understand what that unspoken language is. Yeah, it could work very well. Sergio Leone, I mean, obviously westerns, just westerns, spaghetti westerns in general, are baked into the Dark Tower. Arthurian legend, mythology, all of this stuff. So many science fiction stories you can't even it's there's so much going on there that they could pay homage to. And, like, for example, they could, any adapter of the Dark Tower of the Dark Tower books could take cues from the directorial styles of myriad different directors, like Peter Jackson, like Sergio Leone, like Akira Kurosawa, all of whom have significant bearing on the Dark Tower stories. That would work really well. That would work really, really well. The writers and directors could go back and look at, like, the history of the spaghetti western, of the Arthurian epic in cinema, and build those elements in. It would work really, really well. Also, they could look at King's own cinematic conventions, the other adaptations that have gone before. They could go and look at The Shining and The Stand and all of this stuff and bake those in. It would work very well. And originally, there were certain figures that have been attached to a potential Dark Tower adaptation. One of them was Frank Darabont, director of both The Mist and The Shawshank Redemption. He would have been absolutely perfect because Frank Darabont gets King. As those who have seen The Mist and The Shawshank Redemption will understand, Frank Darabont has an understanding of how to adapt King's work that verges on the supernatural or the preternatural. He just gets it. He not only gets it, he gets how to enhance the original stories, but without detracting or deviating from them. The best example I can think of is the ending of The Mist. The ending of The Mist is fantastic. It's one of the best endings to a horror film I've ever seen, because it doesn't change the ending of the original short story. It just goes further. So whereas the original short story ends at a very particular and very ambiguous point, the film adaptation that Frank Darabont directed does not. It goes further. It just carries on for another 10 minutes, and it shows you what happens to the characters. And it's the cinematic equivalent of being kicked in the balls and then punched in the face for good measure whilst you're writhing on the ground. It feels violent. It actually feels aggressive towards the audience, and that's amazing. That's an amazing thing for any horror film to do. But it feeds into the original themes of The Mist, which is one of King's most nihilistic stories. It really is. It's an apocalypse without hope. It's a commentary on human nature and scapegoating tendencies and fanaticism, tribalism, that is entirely misanthropic. It's a really dark story. And Frank Darabont's adaptation of The Mist plays into that beautifully. Darabont directing a series of Dark Tower films or a TV series of the Dark Tower would have been spectacular. At least you would have had faith in him. Another person attached at one point purportedly was none other than Guillermo del Toro, who would have got the metaphysics, he would have got the sort of fairy tale and mythological illusions of the Dark Tower, and would have understood the cinematic cues. He would have got it because he is so immersed in this stuff and is a very, very, very good director. I would have loved to have seen Guillermo del Toro's Dark Tower. I would have loved to have seen it. Guillermo del Toro, director of one of my favorite films of all time, Pan's Labyrinth, one of the most beautiful films ever, 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 ever set to celluloid. Assuming it was, it may have been digital, but you know what I mean. He would have been perfect. Unfortunately, whether anything was ever done with these adaptations is hard to say, because you'd find rumors of them floating around the early internet. You'd find the odd little thing, and then they'd go away. They'd go away for months, sometimes for years. Then something new would crop up, and then that would go away. Sometimes you get a picture, sometimes you get a whisper of who was going to be cast as Roland or as the Man in Black or as Jake Chambers or whatever, and then it would go away again. Until quite recently, something did occur. There was a Dark Tower film released at the cinema, and it was all very exciting when we heard about it, because the casting was simultaneously unexpected and perfect. Unexpected and perfect. The cast was Idris Elba as Roland Deschain. I would never have thought that, but it works. It works so bloody well. And one of the things the film, we'll get on to the relative qualities or lack thereof of the film at some point soon, but the one thing I really like that the film does is the gunslingers and the line of Arthur Eld are all black. They are like the keepers of an ancient lore, and that works so well. I can't even tell you, it works so well. And Idris Elba is great in the role. He's very good. And Matthew McConaughey is cast as the Man in Black and is very, very good. In fact, I would say of all the qualities the film has, Matthew McConaughey is probably the best one. Matthew McConaughey is just wonderful. Whenever he's on screen, you just pay attention. He's sublimely, brilliantly awful. He's like a walking avatar of negativity and malevolence, and is lots of fun to be around. Unfortunately, the film, I feel, was misconceived from the get-go. It was misconceived from the get-go. First of all, just producing a single film in this mythology was always going to fail. It was always going to fail. There's too much. There's too much in Roland alone. There's too much in his background. There's too much complexity in the character. There's too much in the mythology that surrounds him and the ways that he's traveled. Him alone is too much. Then you add in all the stuff about the Dark Tower being the spine of all reality, the beams that crisscross it, the myriad dimensions that operate on them, the machinery that allows, or the magic that allows you to walk from one to the other, the Man in Black, the Crimson King. By the way, the Crimson King is hardly ever mentioned in this entire film. Hardly ever mentioned at all, because the filmmakers know. They know that they don't have the space, that it's too much. What they do, I mean, it's not a bad film. It's not a bad film at all. It's a decent, passable kind of meh science fiction fantasy action film with some very good scenes in it. However, I will say this, I watched it the first time quite recently actually, and like the day after, I forgot almost everything about it. Like all the details, everything was just sort of the plot, what happens, just swept from my mind. I just couldn't retain it. And part of the problem with that is that all of the gifts that this franchise gives to cinema makers, to filmmakers, to people who work in visual mediums, you know, the touchstones with Sergio Leone, with Akira Kurosawa, with all of these filmmakers just aren't there. There's nothing there. It is shot in this very slick, very postmodern style that's too stylized. It feels like it feels synthetic and it feels Teflon. There's far too much use of CG in normal operations and too much focus on very elaborate action set pieces where Roland is like hurling bullets into the air and chambering them by bringing the chamber down on the falling bullets. And it's kind of like, no, that's not what the Dark Tower is like. That's not what the books are like. They have this real grit to them. They have this real dirt and weightiness about them. And this just doesn't capture it. It's too clean. It's too slick. And the storytelling is the same. It's actually, given what they've got to communicate, which is a hell of a lot within the space of a very, very, very short time frame, they do a decent job. There's some good little bits here. I like Jake Chambers. I love the kid who plays Jake Chambers. I love the way they set up his circumstances. It's too much and too quick and told in too sort of disposable a style. The actual plot is nothing. It's absolutely nothing. You get like next to nothing going on here. And because there's so much that it's trying to express and to explore, it tries myriad ways of bulking itself out, of trying to blend in all of that stuff from the books, which is ambient, the wider mythology and all that, but it's just not enough. It's just sadly just not enough. There's some excellent moments, there's some excellent character pieces, there's some great acting, there's some great direction. It's just not what the Dark Tower really ideally should be. And it's a bit forgettable, if I'm honest. If you look at other films in a kind of similar vein, it just doesn't do anything that special. And that's a real shame because the Dark Tower could be special. It really could. If they could get Frank Darabont or Guillermo del Toro or someone like that to write and direct a Netflix style series of the Dark Tower, it could be amazing. It could be absolutely amazing. But the film that exists, the film that occurs, like I said, I feel like I'm damning with faint praise here. It's good, it's fine. There's nothing technically wrong with it at all. It's just also nothing very special. It doesn't do anything that I find remarkable. It doesn't it like visually, for example, there's nothing remarkable about the direction. There's nothing remarkable about the framing of the film. Mythologically, it gives you only the barest surface stuff from the Dark Tower books. And as such, it does come off as this faintly derivative science fiction fantasy piece where there's far too much of characters like talking to one another, but they're actually talking to the audience. They're basically engaging in exposition. They're talking to the audience about what's going on, and it's a bit too much. It's like we get that there's a lot to cram in here, but that's why this film was misconceived from conception. It should never have been a single film. They could have done something with it Like if they'd have gone down the Peter Jackson route, where it was like, I mean, Peter Jackson had his work cut out for The Lord of the Rings, technically. Even within the constraints of 3 films, he had his work cut out. And boy, I mean, the editing work they do on those films to get the story in and get all the salient details in is amazing. It's absolutely incredible. But it does require someone with the panache of Peter Jackson and his editorial and directorial and writing team to do that. And this film didn't really have it. Let's be honest, this film didn't really have it. There's just not enough going on here. It's lovely for fans of the books to see things like the way stations, to see Midworld, to see some of the demons and things that inhabit Midworld. That's all really good. It's great to see Jake. It's great to see the tower itself and the beams and the breakers. To see the breakers, the kids with psychic potential that King has been obsessed with his entire career, who have a culmination point in the Dark Tower mythology. The servants of entropy, the servants of the Crimson King, the elemental force of all negativity who's trying to bring the tower down, are gathering the children. They call them breakers and strapping them into machines so that in the books they're weakening the beams that hold the tower up. They're not attacking the Dark Tower itself, but of course that's very difficult to realize in a film and to explain. So in this adaptation, what they do is make it so that the children are strapped into machines that harness they call it the shining. It's the shine. It's what Danny Torrance has. They sort of enhance and utilize their shining to assault the tower, to actively attack the tower. That's not really what's going on in the books, but I can see why they adapted it a little for the film here. Um, Unfortunately, it does lead to some confusions because there's a point where there's an assault on the tower and you see it. It kind of shakes all of reality. It causes earthquakes and natural phenomena and all that kind of thing. And Roland says, "Oh, it's a beam quake." Well, up until that point, we haven't really been told what the beams are or what their significance is to the wider mythology. So when Roland says, "Oh, it's a beam quake, a strong one," most audiences, the people who haven't read the books, are like, "What? What the hell does that mean?" No, it isn't. We've seen what it is. The film has told us what it is. It's these psychic kids who are strapped into this machine that's then blasting at the tower. It's not a beam quake. We don't even know what a beam is. There's lots of stuff like that where the people who created this film are clearly fans of the books. They've clearly read the books. There are loads of symbols and images from the books scattered throughout. And that's lovely. That's really nice. I love those little nods to the fans. But, and it's a big but, the film is kind of Teflon. It doesn't do enough. Like Idris Elba's take on Roland isn't given enough time to breathe. You really don't get a sense of who this guy is properly. You don't get a sense of like Roland Deschain's depth from this version of the gunslinger. And that's a great shame. That's a great shame. Matthew McConaughey, on the other hand, really does. I mean, he just goes for the absolute villainy of the Man in Black, the charm, the sort of like Lucifer whispering in the ear kind of thing. That's what he's going for, and it works. It works fine because that's who the Man in Black is. I mean, compared to Idris Elba, Matthew McConaughey's got the easier time because the Man in Black is an archetype. He's so easy to render because he's just negative. He's just evil, whereas he's just ruinous, and that's portrayed all the way through. I mean, whenever he is wandering around like any of the real worlds, outside of like the more mythological worlds that Roland hails from, he's just casually doing things like waving his hand and making people turn on one another, or making people enact really hideous violence upon one another, because he's just a monster. He is an elemental force of entropy and negativity, and that's what he's doing. He's trying to bring everything down. All of reality he's trying to bring to chaos, so it makes sense for him. And Matthew McConaughey's just having a ball. He does it really well. Unfortunately, I mean, Idris Elba does a really good job as well. He's very good as Roland. He brings a certain gravitas and weight to the character, as well as a certain humanity as well. But there's not enough for him here. There's just not enough time to delve into who the gunslinger is, where he's come from, what he represents. There's just not enough here, unfortunately, and that leaves him feeling slightly underbaked, which may have been fixed if the series had gone on, but it did so badly that the sequel it clearly sets up at the end never occurred. So Who knows? Once again, we find ourselves in limbo with the Dark Tower adaptations. Maybe. We are in the days, obviously, the heydays of the Netflix or streaming service now. So who knows? Maybe there will be at some point a Dark Tower adaptation. Fingers crossed, because in order to work, it's going to have that weird, almost preternatural, sublime confluence of elements where the writers, the directors, the actors, everyone involved gets it. They understand. They've read the books. They understand the books, and they understand what people want from them. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. It is just never going to work. But when we come back, my loves, we will move on to the last in this series, The Dark Tower itself, Book 7, and the very end of the mythology. Sort of. The sort of end of the mythology. You'll see what I mean when we get there. Until then, my dears, bye-bye!